Good morning, everyone. So my name is Sarah Faulkner. I'm the Director of Marketing at Goddard. To start us off, I would just like to say on behalf of the entire Goddard team, I hope you and your families and coworkers are home and healthy. These are weird, strange, scary times. So it's really lovely to virtually be able to connect with our engineering and med tech communities. A big thank you to MassMEDIC for assisting us in putting together today's webinar and getting the word out. It's always a real joy for me to partner with Brian and Rachel and the whole team. So thanks, guys. So I won't delay us any further. It's my pleasure to introduce today's speakers who will share their insights into the human factors engineering process. Joining us today is Omar Bermudez, who's the Senior Industrial Designer at Goddard, and Orlando Soto, a Principal Mechanical Engineer at Goddard. So without further ado, I will pass the baton over to them. Enjoy.
So good morning, everyone. Sarah, next slide, please. This is Omar. So who is Goddard? We're a product development company that has been providing over 20 years of product success stories. We're currently 44 employees strong, and we're spanning 2 coasts. We have office in Boston and in San Diego office as well. Our core competencies revolve around med device development, life sciences and diagnostic tools, and we also span into the high-tech consumer and industrial product world. What we bring to the table is a blending of mechanical engineering and industrial design that solves difficult product development challenges. So what are we going to be up to today? Well, our goal for today is to provide some insight into the HFE process and highlight some areas that can help and some of the areas that can hinder it. We're going to be discussing a little bit about human factors definitions. We'll be talking about common assumptions and some of the pitfalls that they present. And we'll be talking about design versus instructions, or the spirit of the HFE process. And then hopefully at the end, we'll have a little bit of time for some Q&A. At this point, I'll turn things over to Orlando, and he's going to be taking us through this first section.
Thank you, Omar. I'm Orlando. As Omar indicated, I'm a principal mechanical engineer. I do a lot of the human factors activity with Goddard. I just wanted to give a brief intro into human factors engineering and what it entails. We'll be doing that over the course of the next few slides. So what is human factors engineering? Human factors engineering is the methods and process by which humans are integrated into the system under development. And the whole idea of human factors engineering is to ensure that that integration is seamless. And in the context of med device development, a big important part of the human factors engineering process is to ensure that as the human is integrated into the system, that the use of the product or the system and its operation is safe and effective. Human factors engineering can apply to everything from a button size to the room that the product will be in. We'll touch on those elements in a little bit. Many different things relate to the human factors engineering process, and there are many different aspects of how a user interfaces and engages with the product that can trigger certain situations in the risk activity and in the process of human factors engineering. These are referred to as hazards, but there are many different things that can trigger certain hazards, and some of them might not be as evident as everybody would hope. So some of these elements that can trigger hazards include environmental aspects associated to the environment the product is operating in. There could be certain elements associated to the user demographics, so users that are engaging with a product. Are they highly trained users like surgeons and healthcare professionals? Or are they lay people that have a wide range of cognitive capabilities? They might have a wide range of schooling and education. And as an effect of that, they might have a difference in what type of information they're able to absorb and how they're able to absorb it. There's other elements associated to a combination of the environment and the users that could precipitate habits of use, which we're going to touch on in a little bit. And then there's elements associated to visual cues that may be presented to the user. They might also be audible cues that are presented to the user as an artifact of the use environment. A big part of human factors and some of the pitfalls associated to the proper implementation of human factors in a project relate to omissions. So a lot of the times it's not what you did, it's what you failed to do or failed to understand or didn't maybe discern in its entirety that can get you in trouble, especially as products kind of migrate from the sterile / controlled test environment out into the marketplace where anything can go. So understanding the quality of some of the information that's being uncovered as part of the usability process or the human factors process is important, because again, a lot of those issues or a lot of the hiccups in the execution come from omissions rather than commissions in the process. As a result of that, that's why it's important to start things early related to the human factors activities. The idea of why should I start human factors activities if I don't even have a finished product yet sometimes comes up as we're advising or supporting some of these activities. And maybe not even a finished product, but at least some kind of finished device. Maybe it's not in its finished final form for release, but the idea that, oh, I need to have a finished alpha or beta prototype. There's other ways and there's methodologies that can be applied so that you don't technically need a finished product. The reason to do that is, again, because we need to understand all those other aspects, all those aspects related to the environment, the user demographics. Those are important to know up front, such that we can then start incorporating those observations and those findings into the design. Those of us that have been intimate with product development processes in the past know that as time elapses in product development, things start to solidify. Sometimes the product development word that's used is freeze. So there's certain design freezes that occur. Purchases may be made, certain investments in tooling might have occurred. And as those things start happening in the product development cycle, they're kind of analog to certain design commitments being made. So for all these reasons, it's important to bring in some of these human factors activities into the front end of the product development cycle. We need to know these things so that we can include them as part of the design thinking that leads to fully fleshed out interfaces and touch points, so that we can minimize the risk burdens associated to a project. Sometimes an artifact of not doing so is that we start putting a lot of the risk control and a lot of the burdens on instructional materials and training. And that's okay. There's a certain burden that the instructional materials and training can tolerate, but it is no substitute for managing the user interface and the user integration process through design elements. A lot of that understanding is also echoed in some of the regulation associated to risk management and usability applied to med device development. So in the next slide, we're going to touch on some of these nuances in a little more detail. The idea of how to know things up front sometimes comes up. You know, how, if we don't have a finished product, what are the various things that we can do to start uncovering some of these nuances? One of the first things we tell a lot of our partners and clients is that a very important part of human factors is to immerse yourself in the user's experience. So how can you do that, and how can you immerse yourself in a user experience? A lot of our partners and a lot of corporations leverage members of the organization with direct use and use environment knowledge. These could be people like Salesforce, for example, in med device and certainly in surgical products. The Salesforce is there day to day with these clients. There might be clinical representatives. There might be that manage some of the clinical trials for a product. They also have a lot of direct experience and relationships with these users. So we always try to leverage direct use experience as much as possible. I always try to reiterate that there is no substitute for firsthand knowledge and firsthand experience, because as information is transferred from person A with the direct experience to person B to person C, it can become a little bit of a game of telephone. So some of that nuance erodes and is lost. So that's certainly something we want to avoid. And again, as much as possible, it's important to immerse yourself in the use environment so you can develop certain levels of empathy and understanding for what the various users have to manage and interact with. On this slide, we have a picture of an operating room. We can see that it is pretty busy. It's pretty cluttered. There's a lot of monitoring equipment. You can be assured that a lot of those pieces of monitoring equipment all emit their own little chirp or their own little beep. So if you've ever been in an OR with a patient in there and in a procedure, we're all pretty aware of all those little chimes and beeps and heart rate little things going off in the background. All that to say that, for example, if your product is going to include a little audible alarm and it's subject to an environment like this, that audible alarm may end up being a little less efficacious than you imagine it, because of all the audible clutter that exists in the environment as well. So it's a funny thing that a lot of these monitoring equipments all have their own distinct little chirp and beep. They all sound a little different. They all have different actual sound profiles to them to be able to distinguish them from one piece of equipment to another. We can also see that there is a lot of cables hanging off of these pieces of equipment. A lot of them are for various electrodes or pieces of monitoring that may get hooked up to a patient. Others might be for actual pieces or consumables that are part of the surgical procedure. So another element here that I'm trying to reiterate is that there might be a low appetite for yet another cable in terms of how these users manage some of these interface elements. A lot of these cables can become tripping hazards, and sometimes you'll see a lot of surgeons and nurses too kind of pre-set up the cable management as part of the setup for a procedure. So those are elements that if you're not privy to that firsthand knowledge, those little things could become eroded. They may not factor into your design because the information doesn't make it all the way to the design engineers. And then it might actually get omitted. Another element that I sometimes bring up is, even though this operating room might look fully lit up, there are some procedures where the surgeons, just by preference, they prefer to dim the lights. So in minimally invasive surgery and some arthroscopic work, the surgeon doesn't have direct line of sight to what they're doing because it's not an open procedure. They can only see the video that some of the minimally invasive tools are providing back to them. So they're looking at monitors, and sometimes the big lights or the heavy lighting in the room can precipitate glare onto the monitor. So a lot of the surgeons prefer to dim the lights so they can see the monitor and the colors on the monitor a lot more clearly. And then dimming the lights might have a certain effect on user interfaces if they're not backlit or they're not designed to consider the fact that for certain procedures, not all of them, but for certain procedures, sometimes the lights actually go dim so the surgeon can visualize things on monitors a little better. So all those understandings and realizations may affect the design. Again, if they're not properly considered or the human factors activity up front is not designed to reveal them, they may become omissions in the design or omissions in the data. that is being fed into the design process. So that's why it's important for human factors engineering activity to be present and occurring on the front end of the development cycle. The important aspect of that endeavor is to gather valuable data points early instead of waiting until you have a finalized design, so that those data points can be used to inform the design rather than confirm the design. Because if we leave it all the way to just the confirmation, once we get to the confirmatory checkpoint, that's where a lot of the omissions can suddenly reveal themselves, and now we're kind of scrambling to see how we mitigate them as part of our risk control process. So a big way that we can inform these design elements early is with conceptual prototypes. The idea is that your user interface may not be developed in full. If you have graphical user interfaces, it may not be all pretty and polished. But the important part is to drive some confirmation or some understanding to where those interface elements are located. For example, buttons on a device don't need to be functional, but they may be placed in the correct place, for example, on a grip or a handle or a sliding mechanism on a handle. We might use conceptual prototypes to just confirm that the placement of the interface elements are correct. They don't need to be functional. So sometimes I know as engineers, we want everything to be done before we put it in front of a user. But there's ways here to accelerate some of those insights and the data gathering so that we don't necessarily need to put a finished product or finished prototype in front of a user. The other thing that we can do is drive that iteration on smaller user groups, because again, the important part is to evolve the design and evolve the knowledge base so that we feed that into the design groups properly with enough advance so that they can internalize that information and include it as part of their design activity. With that being said, I'm going to leave it to Omar to discuss in detail assumptions. So Omar, take it away.
Thanks, Orlando. So hopefully we all understand what a treasure trove of information a well-executed HFE activity can bring to the process. And I'll go ahead and interpret this silence as complete agreement on that note. Well, our goal is to strive to find data that is truthful and accurate. And unfortunately, sometimes we self-sabotage these endeavors. One of the more common ways of polluting our data is forgetting about our user or our users and replacing them with ourselves. The bad data that can leak in from many false assumptions. For example, assuming that because I can do it, so can they. My grip, my reach, my line of sight, etc. All these things being equivalent with my user. Not recognizing different cognitive capabilities. This kind of shows itself with trained users and non-trained users. It can show itself with institutional knowledge that the user may possess that I don't possess. Maybe some standard operating procedures that my user may be privy to that I may not be privy to. And generally maybe some habits that my user has that I may not know. Failure to recognize different physical capabilities. This is a pretty common example, the young versus old. This one kind of hits home a little bit as my eyesight gets a little worse and worse, and type sizes seem to be getting smaller and smaller. I've been pulling the old iPhone light trick to read menus at restaurants more often than I care to admit, but that's such is life. Varying anatomy, thinking that my fingers may not fit through a dangerous crevice, but a smaller individual's may, or that my hand is small enough to avoid a pinch point, but a larger hand may not be. The user's confidence or their overconfidence, as I'm sure many of you have probably witnessed, performing maybe an IFU formative and having a surgeon completely skipping the instructions and relying on his or her expertise and know-how, where I, lacking that expertise or know-how, may actually fully read an IFU. Well, this happens to all of us, but recognizing that we may have supplemented our users early and correcting early should help stave off any potential of following the wrong design solutions. On to the second point, adequate representation of your user group. So we recognize that this is a challenge, but we need to recruit enough users to yield statistically meaningful results. And these users should be diverse enough to cover as many potential gaps as possible. Again, the effort here is to generate data that yields successful design solutions. One thing of note is that this is where a good user definition will go a long way in helping bracket the demographic spread, or at least in theory. This tries to keep things from getting a little too out of hand. Also, we need to challenge our own assumptions of what our ideal user is. And sometimes we need to provide what our least ideal user could be. We want to think through the user's characteristics and how they could impact the product development. Things like low-hanging fruit here, age, gender, education. More subtle things like mobility or cognitive ability. We should strive to try to cover as many, or we should try to strive users that cover as much of the spectrum as possible to fill in any gaps in our user group. I think this is an area where we have gotten pretty creative, and I'm sure some of you have as well. Not that long ago, we were performing formative studies on a wound care device. The device itself would be applied post-op with the required skilled, trained healthcare provider, and then managed at the home by the patient. So recruiting enough lay people that didn't have any prior knowledge proved to be a little bit difficult. Enough so that a good chunk of our staff's immediate family and extended family spent a lot of quality time in the office with various bandages stuck to them. So we got to know all the nieces, nephews, grandparents, and so forth. Moving on to our third point, maintaining neutrality throughout testing. So recognizing that it is certainly easy to lead people into giving you the information you want to hear, we must craft questions and inputs that are bias-free and remove the tester's influence from our inquiries. This is a common directive to assume that we are getting it right, but unless we strive to actively combat this, we risk the introduction of poor data. The active component I'm referring to here is the action of performing a gut check against our own biases. As we move through the HFE activity, we actively look for instances of using leading questions or loaded questions, performing leading actions. This can be as simple as just handing some packaging to a user with the instructions facing them, as opposed to mocking up a shelf and having them pull supplies from a shelf. Projecting body language in order to entice a response or to lead an answer. Things like hovering over a user to encourage them to generate maybe data that could appease our engineering managers or design managers, rather than letting a user engage a product to understand the possible use errors and ensure proper risk control mitigation can be applied. So I could go on, but the gist here is that maintaining neutrality is not a passive endeavor. Rather, you must actively question and challenge yourself to achieve it. This carries us over to the use environment in which you're conducting testing. Thanks, Sarah. We want to, as closely as possible, mirror the real life environment in which you are intending the product to be used. As Orlando mentioned earlier, there are some unforeseeable influences in the environment that will impact the use case and resultantly the product's development. So for example, if your product is intended for use in a high stress constrained envelope in a dynamic environment like an ambulance, we want to make sure that our testing environment captures those circumstances so that our data reflects the critical influences and essentially ultimately yielding a better product solution. Other areas we must try to capture can be movement hazards, maybe trip hazards. As Orlando mentioned, lighting is a big area that we should consider. Wet or dry environment, and even adding stresses like noises or cold or heat to the use environment in order to solicit the best possible solution. Even clearance issues This one became quite a concern of ours as we were developing a hip distractor system. This is a device that took up a good chunk of the OR, and it required a sizable team of users, all needing to move in and out of the area with a patient's leg in somewhat awkward positions and blocking a lot of the OR. All of this while trying to move tools and materials in and out of the operating theater. Fortunately, we were able to create a one-to-one scale model, and having a full team perform a mock-up procedure within that model led to some insightful adaptations to the overall system. We did this early and was able to actually impact the overall design of the system. All these parameters can lead to success or a failure of a device. Executing rather than assuming will yield an informed decision. So finally, don't focus on just the product's perfect use case. So witnessing patterns of misuse and preemptively researching similar products and their misuse, this can help fill in design parameters that may not have been otherwise understood or could have been missed just in general. We need to recognize that defining foreseeable misuse and uncovering use errors is an important part of the usability risk control, which in turn is all part of a robust HFE effort. An added value of uncovering use errors early is the help with mitigation through the device design of what could be endless rounds of IFU and quick start guides iterations to correct a use case or a use error that could have been mitigated earlier through design efforts. As such, it could be beneficial to create a use case test that is less than ideal in order to elicit a use error or to just witness how a user may adjust their behavior or their use case. So now, fortunately, in the medtech industry, we do have searchable databases put out by the FDA that describe real-life errors, safety issues, which are reported with specific devices. I'm referring to here the MOD, which is the Manufacturer and User Facility Device Experience Database. It's highly recommended to use these resources to predict and assess how the design of your product could lead to use error or safety hazards. And in closing out this section, we can see that poorly vetted assumptions ultimately lead to products that don't serve its intended audience, and thus consequently, they do not fulfill its purpose in the marketplace. I'll be turning this over to Orlando to take us home.
Thank you, Omar. So hopefully we've driven home the idea of why it's important to manage things over the course of the design, that is to say, over the early stages of product development versus the instructional materials. In the next slide, we'll be tying this up a little more clearly. One example that I like to use to stress some of these points is the example of a car manufacturer. So if we can imagine a car manufacturer that over the course of their design process, maybe they're a new car manufacturer, they don't have a lot of experience in the field. This manufacturer has decided to make a car with the gas pedal on the left and the brake on the right. They decided, or the engineers there decided, well, it's a component. It's just a component. Makes more sense to place it here. We're going to include clear indications on the instructions and the user's manual that, hey, and the brake is on this side and the gas is on the other side. Maybe they've already made some commitments to assembly line or production equipment or whatever the case may be. They've decided that, hey, we're just going to put a lot of stickers here and a lot of warnings to say that in this particular model of car, the brake and the accelerator are inverted. Well, as you can imagine, sitting at an intersection, your light has turned green, you're starting to move through, all of a sudden you look to the right and you realize that the guy on the other side decided he thought he could make the yellow, but he's not. So all of a sudden, in a very stressful situation, you go to stomp on the brake and you realize your car is lurching forward at high speeds because muscle memory has kicked in, habits from your previous vehicles have kicked in, and you've just slammed on the accelerator when you meant to slam on the brakes. Obviously, this is a hazardous situation I'm describing, and bad things are going to happen as an artifact of habits, as an artifact of design decisions, and information that may not have been properly revealed to this manufacturer. But they decided that a warning on the user's manual and perhaps a sticker on the dash was enough to mitigate the situation. So in med device, it comes up a lot where certain design decisions have been made. Perhaps the level of exploration or the level of cross-check at the development stage was not as potentially robust as it could be. And then there's always elements downstream that come up that the organization or the project team might be under some pressure to mitigate. They can't take design mitigations anymore, so the instructional materials, the training associated to a product is now doing a little more heavy lifting. There are ways to do that as part of the instructional materials. There are certain levels of hierarchy in terms of how you use font size, how you use bold text, potentially how you use color, how you use graphics to communicate information. But a lot of the times, there are certain habits that truly should be addressed in design, and certain user proclivities or user predispositions should be worked with, as opposed to working against or making the assumption that a user can overcome them. And then when those tactics start compounding, the result can be a fairly complicated IFU. So I'll use the next slide as an example. So in the next slide, we can see that, it's not necessarily an IFU, but it's kind of the same thing. It's to keep with the car and transit example here. If a user is approaching this kind of an intersection, even though there is an ample amount of warnings being communicated to the user, just the amount of it might be a little overwhelming. I know personally, if I were approaching this intersection, I know that maybe I'm supposed to yield, and there might be other things happening around there, children running across or work. But other than that, I don't have a lot of clarity as to what I'm trying to be warned about here. And we can see that at this point, the amount of information that's trying to be communicated for the venue is a little too much. So this scenario can also happen in the instructions that go along with the device. Understanding at what point is the IFU becoming a little too heavy. Maybe we're communicating too much information that's meant for the healthcare provider in the context of medical devices and not so much for the lay user. At what point does it make sense to potentially break out a quick start guide or a quick little pamphlet that really synthesizes all the core information in one single place that's very easy to read, very easy to comprehend, maybe is also supported with a couple of graphics that really drive clarity to the core use aspects of the product. That's a lot of the activity that we sometimes are engaged to support and develop. What I'm trying to drive home here is that overburdened IFUs, instructions for use, don't work well. So a big part of the back-end activity on product design is developing the IFU and potentially some of the training materials such that they facilitate proper use, such that the proper use occurs without the incidence of errors or misinterpretations that could lead to hazardous scenarios. And ultimately, a lot of the regulatory agencies and certainly the FDA are going to require, as part of the product development process, that you actually validate the use case to show that the combination of the product design, the instructions for use, and any training that might need to be provided in aggregate all facilitate correct use and safe and efficacious deployment of that device. hopefully we've done a good job driving home the idea that mitigation by design is better. There are things that the IFU and the training can help clarify, and there's a way to drive that clarity. But again, the theme is to start your human factors early, to make sure it is robust, to make sure it's not leading to certain omissions that then need to be addressed downstream where it might be more difficult, and ultimately to have people involved in your human factors process that understand all of this and can become advocates for its proper execution. So with that, I'm happy to wrap up this presentation and open it up to any questions or comments that anybody might have.
Thanks, anyone. We're happy to take any questions you might have. You can just drop them in the chat box, either to myself privately or to the group as a whole. I've got a question here for Omar and Orlando. You mentioned about integrating human factors engineering activities early in the design and development process. Can you talk a little bit, I know you shared some examples, but can you talk a little bit about the kinds of activities that companies can do when they don't yet have a working prototype or a finished product?
Sure, I'll jump in here, and Omar, feel free to supplement after I'm done. But one of the first things that can be done as part of early stage product development, and it's actually something that the FDA actually looks at to some degree as they're reviewing a submission, for example, is what's currently wrong, what's going on with similar products, right? Omar had mentioned the device reportable databases, for example, MOD. A big part of what can be done up front is understand how other products may not be fully addressing some of the user needs, or may not be fully addressing some of the use risks with a product. Those will show themselves in the reportables databases. And then understanding how the new product or the product that's under development can address these or include these or answer to these is always something that the FDA is going to welcome. They're going to want to see a nice evolution to product safety. And certainly they're going to want to see that as new products are being introduced and go under review. A second way that these activities can be done early on is by using and designing user surveys. So user surveys are a pretty good soft tool that doesn't require an actual prototype or a physical model to be present in order to start uncovering and revealing some of this information. One aspect that for us has been very educational for some of our clients is as part of these surveys, including to what degree doctors or physicians might be training or not training their patients as an artifact of, for example, an inhaler or a combination drug delivery product that they might be prescribing or sending the patient home with. Because we've found that a lot of our customers sometimes have bullish assumptions regarding the level of training that some of these healthcare professionals are in fact providing to their users. Sometimes our clients are surprised to see that there's actually gaps in training that the doctors might be providing. And a lot of the times it's because the manufacturer does not prompt or tell the physician that they are indeed supposed to provide some level of training to their users. Those are a few examples of some of the front-end activity without getting into some of the conceptual prototypes I already mentioned that can be used to drive some of that information that's important for the design aspect of the product development process and certainly for human factors.
That's great. Thanks, Orlando. I know we're a few minutes over our time here, so I want to be respectful of everybody's time. Thank you guys so much for joining us today. This was a lot of fun for us. We're going to follow up with everybody who registered for today's webinar with a copy of the presentation, a recording of our webinar, and some additional resources that you might need. We've written a white paper on the subject that goes into a bit more detail than we were able to get to today, so we'll be sharing that with everyone. Once again, thanks to MassMEDIC for working with us to put this together and getting everyone here today. We really appreciate it. Thanks, everyone. Be well.
Thanks, Sarah. Thanks, guys.